Hello everyone, this is the finale of What If Naruto Was a Puppeteer, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
The little wooden doll was chipped and scratched in places, many of the joints replaced after being broken or severed. Naruto wasn't even sure why he kept the thing. He wasn't a particularly sentimental person by nature. Yet, he had made Hanabi use the very same anatomical doll that he had first practiced with. He could have made something better in no time at all, but he refrained. He now held it in his hand, sitting forward in his desk chair and just looked at it. Every scratch was a little story, and he could almost see his younger self trying to get down a new, or smoother motion with that frustrated growl. He glanced up and looked at Inari, sitting cross-legged in a cushion of her own tails. Like this, only the lack of rise and fall of her chest gave away the fact that she wasn't just some strange kitsune spirit taking a moment for herself. He held the doll up and, for a moment, just let himself marvel at how far he had come. He still keenly remembered the deep dissatisfaction he had felt every time he had come home, having mastered a new technique or successfully completed a mission, only to look at that taunting bingo book entry on the wall and feel like it just wasn't enough. He didn't feel that now. He was far from saying that he was a master of his craft. Every day revealed something new for him to learn or tweak, something else that he hadn't known or could have improved. But he was finally at a point in his life where he could appreciate all that he had accomplished. Sometimes, he admitted that much of it had come at a cost. He didn't think he would ever truly understand people, and he was robbed of many of the formative friendships that might have changed that. He didn't regret it though. Couldn't. If he lingered too long in that mindset, he would never be able to drag himself back, never be able to move forward. And moving forward was what he planned to do. He had learned from the mistakes of others, from the rash, unattainable ambitions of Mikade, to the stilted, unmovable concept of perfection Sasori held. His was a dogma of constant change, constant improvement. Nothing was sacred, nothing was perfect, but nothing was impossible. He glanced at the clock, still not quite time. He stood, setting the doll down and moving over to the window. He had chosen this plot mostly because of the cheapness of the land and the convenience of the crater that used to be his sub-levels. An unintended benefit was a rather remarkable view of the Hokage monument from his upstairs study. It was unchanged for now, but from what he had heard down his grapevine, the chief sculptor was already hounding Jiraiya to get his measurements. Ayumi had come through, naming Jiraiya the Hokage despite the man's blustering self-deprecation and what looked to be a surprise entry into the running from Shimura Danzo. Naruto hadn't even thought about that, but was certainly glad he had inadvertently nipped it in the bud. He would be the first to point out what a terrible Hokage he would make, but he couldn't imagine a worse outcome than that old warhawk getting the hat. Nothing would have been more antithesis to the values Sarutobi Hiruzen had lived and died for. The scaffolding would probably go up within the week, after the announcement was made, and after Jiraiya got over his childish moping, of course. The small, wistful, sentimental voice, that allowed him to keep that battered old doll long after its use was through, firmly wished he would be around to see it. With that thought in mind, he glanced at the clock again, noting that it was time. He was as ready as he was going to be. Konoha seemed quieter than usual as he slipped along the rooftops, as though the entire village were holding its breath. It allowed him to make good time, and soon, at the agreed-upon time, he was dropping down into the street that ran adjacent to the outer wall, the opposite side of the gate this time. It wouldn't do to become predictable, especially now that the village did once again have a Hokage. He wouldn't have personally described their actions here tonight treasonous, mostly because he didn't think anybody would shed a tear if they were successful. If they weren't, well, he would probably be dead, so who really cared? The recriminations he was dreading would be from his apprentice, when she realized he had gone out and done this without her. There wasn't a chance in hell though that he would put her in that sort of risk, not after last time, and especially not when he wasn't certain of his own success. Damn, Anko needed to show up soon. The longer he just stood here in the dark, the more his thoughts turned introspective and pessimistic. We can do this, he muttered under his breath, leaning further back into the awning of the nearby house so he would be less conspicuous to any passing Anbu up on the wall. You know, A familiar voice piped up from an alleyway to his right. Talking to yourself is supposed to be the first sign of madness. Anko seemed her usual self as she drifted out of the shadows, grinning impetuously. Still, it seemed less genuine tonight, like she lacked the energy to make the facade truly stick. I appreciate the vote of confidence though. I assume that means you're ready. As I'm going to be, you. Her grin gained a darker edge. Oh, I've been ready for this for nearly 2 decades now. Got myself strapped up with explosive tags and everything. He genuinely couldn't tell if she was joking or not, and took a step away from her just to be safe. He begrudgingly had to admit that he was at least becoming somewhat used to the woman's antics, if nothing else. She glanced at the wall, but he shook his head. They couldn't go yet. Now that the village was mostly back up to its organizational standards, they couldn't leave the same way they had before. They had to time it properly, missing Nin's style. When he felt somebody else approach, he wondered if they wouldn't have been better off trying their luck. When I caught you sneaking off, Sasuke said, dropping down from a rooftop, I thought it might be for something more interesting than a midnight tryst. His eyes belied the joke, looking at both Naruto and Anko searchingly. Pretty boy, Anko greeted exuberantly. What a pleasant surprise. We weren't expecting company, but I'd be more than welcome to a little menage a trois. Ignoring that disturbing mental image, Naruto turned to his old teammate. What are you doing here, Sasuke? His tone wasn't particularly accusing. He would have been something of a hypocrite if it was just tired. They didn't need the interruption, tonight of all nights. I think I'll skip the whole, isn't that what I should be asking you? Shtick, because I think it's pretty obvious what you two are up to. I want in. A blonde and violet eyebrow quirked in almost perfect unison. You want in? Naruto repeated blandly, not even doubting that Sasuke could work out what they were up to. It wasn't like Anko and he had many overlapping interests, and when he wanted to be, the last Uchiha could be damn perceptive. Why? He shrugged. I could tell you something about former teammates sticking together, and that's part of it, but we both know that you wouldn't particularly care. Hell, I don't have to give you an answer, I could just sprint back to the Hokage's office and stop this little plan in its tracks. I don't want to, because like I said, I want a crack at Orochimaru myself. What did Snake Face do to you? Anko asked skeptically, giving the teen a once-over. Naruto on the other hand knew there was a perfectly good reason for Sasuke to want to kill Orochimaru, he just shouldn't know about it. I heard he has Sharingan eyes. I want to know how, where he got them, who from, and if he has any more. Those belong to the Uchiha, and I won't have him running his sick experiments on them. Kid, Anko started, only to glance at Naruto and realize that particular condescension wouldn't cut it. Sasuke, right. Grave robbing is sort of the least of my sensei's former crimes. Good, he shot back, then you should be able to come up with all sorts of excuses for me to put a kunai between his eyes. Anko glanced at Naruto, only to see the blonde shrug. He didn't particularly care if Sasuke came. Hell, the Uchiha was a strong shinobi, and the help would probably be appreciated. The only reason they weren't bringing more people was so that Jiraiya didn't find out and try to axe their plan before it could happen. Their thoughts on that matter hadn't changed at all. Jiraiya, when it came to the choice of dealing with Orochimaru or protecting somebody, a choice the Snake Sanin was more than willing to take advantage of, he would hesitate every time. Fine, looks like you're up, duck butt, Anko acquiesced. Naruto hadn't even noticed when Sasuke had activated his Sharingan, but they were narrowed now. Don't call me that. Those same red eyes abruptly flicked to the wall. If we want to successfully get out, we need to move, now. Naruto was glad that their new method of tracking Orochimaru implicitly ignored curse seal uses, thanks to the vital information Taiuya had provided. Otherwise, having Sasuke in their illicit little party would have rendered it entirely useless. His curse seal was still undiscovered, and Naruto fully intended to keep it that way. He still wasn't certain why Orochimaru had placed a piece of his soul into the seals, although his working theory was that it offered him some form of control over their recipients the more they used it. He looked forward to uncovering all of its secrets at his leisure after the man himself was dealt with. And, if the worst came to the worst and Orochimaru could exert some kind of leverage on his two companions. Well, Hanabi had handily displayed that a senbon in the back is hard to plan for when it comes from somebody you trust. It wasn't like he hadn't already planned for fighting Orochimaru alone, if that's what it came to. These were the thoughts that swirled in his head as the group steadily made their way south, seemingly towards the enormous bay that, even further south, curved into the peninsula that became the land of tea. Considering the fact it was bordered by 4 different countries, there was no official name for the large stretch of water. In Hino Kuni at least, it was colloquially referred to as the Sparkling Gulf, for the unparalleled sunrises it was supposed to offer from the peak of the inlet, a few miles east from their apparent destination. They arrived, or at least, Anko's pain became unbearable enough that she was certain they were close enough, just as early miasma of pre-morning twilight was beginning to peek over the horizon. It cast the skies in pale pinks that felt incongruent with the current, anxious mood of the group. Especially when they entered a large, apparently artificial clearing that seemed specially prepared for the occasion, and saw who was already waiting for them. Come now, Naruto-kun, Orochimaru greeted, standing quite at ease in the center of the open space. You do yourself a disservice looking surprised like that. Did you really think, after all this effort you've expended to track me down, that I wouldn't have my own method of keeping track of all my little gifts? He smiled, a thin, insincere thing. I'll admit, I never imagined anybody could turn 'em against me so. He blinked languidly, the very picture of unconcerned. It's the only reason I allowed you to trace me this far, to deal with the problem at the root. Even with his more cloying tendencies, with a method of such accurate tracking at his disposal, Jiraiya may have proved to be an inconvenient thorn, but, his lips turned up in humorless mirth, I don't have to worry about that, do I? He sighed theatrically, shaking his head like a parent amused at a particularly banal display from their progeny. So adamant that you are nothing like Sasori, and yet you take to secrecy just as well as he did. I doubt you've even informed Jiraiya about the alterations you've made to Anko-chan's seal, and once I deal with you 3 here, he will never find out. He sighed again, waving his hand airily. Sometimes, you make this all too easy for me. Nothing about this is going to be easy, Anko spat back, practically vibrating in place from being in such close proximity to the man who had ruined her life and tossed her aside like so much waste. Ah, Anko-chan, as impatient as ever. I used to see that as an abundant willingness to learn, but now I recognize it for the childish hyperactivity it is. His smirk turned cruel as he turned those slitted eyes on his former pupil. Sometimes, I only find myself to blame, for seeing something in you that did not exist. His eyes abruptly flickered right, sinking into the deep red pools of the Sharingan. And speaking of seeing, you've. Any subtle words of derision he might have heaped on Sasuke were quite suddenly interrupted when the Uchiha lurched forward. However, not for an attack. The moment their eyes met, Sasuke all but collapsed, holding his stomach and throat, eyes wide. His expression was matched by the others as they matched, dumbfounded, as what looked to a larger-than-average crow wormed its way out of Sasuke's mouth. It was definitely amongst the top 5 most disturbing things Naruto could claim to have witnessed in his 18 years. It only got stranger when the bird turned its head, still halfway out of the Uchiha's throat, and revealed the slowly spinning Sharingan implanted in place of its left eye. Except, instead of the traditional black tomo, it bore a design not unlike a warped, 4-pronged shuriken. Orochimaru seemed to recognize the significance of the design before either of Sasuke's companions, but was too slow to look away in time. He froze, the condescending mirth draining from his face as his shaking hands came up in a shivering ram seal. The veins in his neck stood out as he seemed to try and resist the compulsion with all of his being, but could not. Slowly, one by one, his hands were forced through a long, complicated series of hand seals before finally resting on Hitsuji. Juinjutsu, Kai, he hissed through gritted teeth, entirely against his own will. It seemed only with these magical words that the compulsion was lifted, entirely too late for him to do anything about it. Sasuke and Anko fell to their knees, eyes bulging and mouths opening in silent screams of pain. They couldn't even muster a scream through the agony erupting from their necks. Both of their containment seals, visible or not, broke instantly, the inky script shattering like glass. Beneath, the Mitsudomo designs wreathed as if sharing their host's distress. They pulsed a sickly green, twisting and contorting as though trying to rip themselves free of the skin they were branded on. It wasn't far off, and as Naruto watched, the curse seals bulged outward, expunging an oily black ichor that instantly evaporated into a dark smoke. With that foul miasma went the seal itself, draining of color, and finally of substance, until all that remained on Sasuke and Anko's neck was a slightly swollen, pale patch of skin resembling the former design. In time, that too would fade. Both had been entirely unable to move throughout the experience, and when it was finally done they both fell forward, slumping into unconsciousness. The crow fluttered down to land by Sasuke's side, cawing through the silence that descended. Then, out of the blue, it burst into black flame without so much as a squawk of protest. In seconds it was nothing but a pile of pale ash, still burning with that evil-looking flame. Orochimaru chuckled, the gesture not quite reaching his eyes as he glared balefully at the little ash pile. I almost didn't believe it when I had heard Itachi-kun met his end at his brother's hand, but now I can be sure of it. Nobody else could thwart me like that, even from beyond the grave. It seems that my sin, above many, was underestimating him. His eyes gleamed, torn between respect and outright fury. To use Uchiha Shisui's Koto Amatsukami, just to free the brother he supposedly hated. It seems our Itachi was far more complex than I gave him credit, and far more vexing than I feared. He cracked his neck and stood straighter. It didn't look like the entire experience had been all that pleasant for him either. No matter, the curse seals can be remade. Spinning red eyes flickered to where Naruto stood, unable to make heads nor tails of the baffling situation that left both of his companions insensate, yet apparently freed from the curse seal. Which only leaves us only with our present matter. Naruto found the man's snake epithet to be more appropriate than ever as he suddenly rushed forward, legs apparently fusing together into a literal snake's tail that allowed him to slither across the distance in the blink of an eye. However, it took more than a bit of confusion to banish Naruto's reflexes, and Orochimaru's knife-handed strike met the edge of one of Inari's tails. She seemed to burst from Naruto's very shadow to meet his assailant, and for a moment, cold Byakugan eyes stared down burning Sharingan. For the first time in history, neither belonged to their respective clan. You know, Naruto started, the sudden attack was exactly what he needed to jolt him back into the moment. My first combat puppet looked an awful lot like you do now. His eyes hardened as adrenaline filled his mind with that familiar heady rush of battle. If I hadn't improved since then, this might have been quite awkward. Orochimaru merely matched his cold expression, smirk for smirk. His seemed more experienced, but there was something to be said for youthful intensity. What a fascinating coincidence, perhaps when I have you strapped to an operating table to remove the Kyuubi, you can regale me with more of your stories. I have always wanted a Biju to play about with, your Uzumaki blood only sweetens the offer. He tried to press forward but, to both of their surprise, it actually appeared that Inari was physically stronger than the Sannin. The artificial muscles in her stomach tightened and the tails whipped out, throwing him back. As if there was some twisted mirror between them, both rushed through hand seals at precisely the same moment. Fuyuten, Daytopper, came the twin cries, and two identical gusts of unrestrained wind slammed into one another. The trees on either side of the clearing creaked warningly, their trunks bowing back against the combined force spilling out on both sides until both techniques ran their course, cancelling out neatly. I am a scientific man, by nature, Orochimaru started up as the two returned to eyeing one another, both waiting for the subtle changes in their opponent's chakra that would signal an attack. So, I believed the novelty of these eyes would wear off, after a time. In truth, their capabilities only continue to amaze me at every turn. Funny, Naruto responded with a bemused smirk, the veins around his eyes bulging ever so slightly. One of Inari's tails flicked backwards and released a jet of water into an empty patch of ground, carving through it like it was butter. The real Orochimaru appeared nearby, eyes narrowed, as the tail swept lazily around the clearing, shearing right through the man's mud clone. On that point, we agree. Ah. Orochimaru sighed in what could be mistaken for wistfulness. If only I had discovered you sooner, you might have actually made a worthwhile apprentice. It actually saddened me slightly when I was forced to flee the Akatsuki. If nothing else, I got along with Sasori quite well. I will have settled for eliminating you here and ridding myself of the future headache. Is that your plan with the daimyo? The blonde drawled as Inari shot forward, engaging the Sannin, to them, a rather lazy bout of taijutsu. Eliminating people that are a nuisance to you through the official channels. Anybody else watching would have barely made out two blurs going at it. Orochimaru's impossible flexibility was a perfect match for Inari's extra limbs. Oh, how endearing it is to see you fumble around in the dark, looking for schemes that simply don't exist, the man taunted, grinning as his eyes catalogued Inari's every movement, growing faster and more confident with his attacks with every passing second. I am a very simple person, once you come to understand my motives. Because, the fact is, I simply want everything. Every jutsu, every technique. I want to understand it all and become a perfect entity. And the daimyo? Naruto asked, brow furrowed. Orochimaru took the opportunity to intensify their fight, whipping around wildly like his arms were his monika's namesake. I wish for them to declare war on one another, to throw the nations into not just a shinobi war, but a world war. Then, when they are in the thick of their conflict, I will have the cage of the 3 remaining major villages assassinated by their most trusted confidants, just as I did my dear sensei. Why? The pale-skinned man pouted, chakra scalpels buzzing to life around his hands and forcing Inari back on the defensive. Come now, Naruto-kun, do I even need to justify myself to you? After all, on this, we are of like mind. The insincere expression twisted into a thin smile. I loved your work along the Shimo border, truly economical work. If it hadn't disrupted some of my own plans in the area, I would have been notably impressed. Naruto's expression immediately hardened, and a thin coating of wind chakra suffused Inari's hands, countering the Sannin's technique and putting the fight back on more even footing. Oh, don't be that way, Orochimaru said. I won't tell. But really, calling me out for starting a war. A little hypocritical, no. Inari's attacks only increased in intensity. How many people died, do you think? For your ambition. For a cause they thought they understood. For nothing more than your own vanity. The man's red eyes narrowed. I hope that is the you that I'm fighting, because the weak, regret-filled Naruto that has been trying so hard to make up for his so-called mistake will find a shallow grave in a contest with me. Really, I had far more respect for you when you were honest with yourself, instead of pretending at being moral, at being good. I quite think that particular ship sailed when you condemned thousands to a messy end, for no better reason than your own bid for strength. The man's eyes glinted as he began to press back, moving faster than even Inari's extra limbs could keep up with. Take all the paltry missions you like. Save your clients. Help people with businesses. Try and extend aid to those in need. We both know that you can never truly make up for the ill you have caused. As if you're so much better, the blonde growled, every inch of his focus on the slippery form of his opponent as he darted in and out of Inari's guard, predicting her strikes milliseconds before they landed. Oh, but I'm not. I'm a sick, twisted individual that wishes to create worldwide chaos simply so that the hiijutsu of the major clans become ripe for the picking, so that these eyes can record all sorts of jutsu in a war the likes of which this continent has never known. What I am not, is a lie, a thin veneer that could crack at any moment and allow all sorts of evil things to spill forth under the slightest pressure. You're a monster, and it must infuriate you, to see yourself in me, mustn't it? You can play at being good all you like, Naruto-kun, but in the end, we both know what lurks under that shallow mask. A hollow thing, that doesn't even fully understand what good is. Oh, you see it around you, even follow in the footsteps of others. My sensei, your father. But do you understand, I wonder? I don't think you do. I think you're so broken, so stunted, that the only way you can convince yourself that you can be good, is to lock your true self somewhere deep inside. His eyes seemed to spin faster, the Tomo-like little black koi, swimming in a pool of blood. What would do it, I wonder? What would crack that vault? Your apprentice, perhaps. I confess, I was never too interested in Sasori's techniques, but I believe I picked up enough that I could do some good work with the girl. Inari's attacks became outright ferocious. The wind chakra sheathing her hands grew outward, becoming ragged claws that would have ripped Orochimaru in half if they could have just connected. But, under his Sharingan, they were as visible as any physical weapon, and even their fluctuating edge was simple enough to dodge when he could see them coming. An academic question, he continued, smiling wickedly, when we have much closer subjects to try first. Has my old apprentice managed to worm her way under your skin yet? I found she has the unique property, given enough time, for her various eccentricities to become interesting, rather than off-putting, endearing even. He used that moment, when Naruto's anger was at its greatest, to lure Inari into overstepping. His leg was like a whip, coming up and striking so fast that the boom of their air it displaced was louder than the actual strike itself. It caught the puppet right on the side of her chest, launching her across the clearing. She immediately corrected her body mid-air, but Orochimaru had been going for distance, not damage. Legs once again fusing into that disturbing tail, he slithered across the clearing to where Anko and Sasuke still lay while Inari was still trying to dig her claws into the ground to arrest her momentum. He pounced at Anko's still form and, while he was still in the air, his Sharingan's eyes managed to just catch Naruto's features switch from coldly furious to a satisfied smirk. Naruto's clones grumbled to themselves in irritation as they moved away from the fight, Anko and Sasuke slung over each of their shoulders. They weren't made for such base labor. Other clones got to work on puppets, carving the wood or fixing up the damage. No, they got to play piggyback to an irritating self-proclaimed nymphomaniac and his surly former teammate. Their hair was whipped into a frenzy by the gust of warm wind that snaked through the trees. One of them turned, looking up at the enormous cloud of smoke that was rising into the air. Lit from below by the fires of the explosion, it was quite a sight. He whistled in appreciation, getting the other to turn around. Their progenitor would probably appreciate the view from afar, because that close, the real Naruto was probably going to feel it. Damn, those tweaks to the formula on the explosive tags are really paying off. Naruto waited until the waves of scalding air stopped buffeting him to lower his hand away from his eyes. Although he could have been blindfolded for all that it mattered, he had seen his decoys explode in exquisite detail through Inari's Byakugan. The explosion was one thing, but witnessing Orochimaru be blown back, skin rippling from the intensity of the blast, was truly magnificent. He would have to tweak the yield though, the fires across the Sanin's body had been put out from the sheer speed of his flight. This might be youthful arrogance talking, he said, grinning as Inari slinked back to his side, or whatever you want to call it, but I genuinely believe that will never grow old. He continued walking forward, feet crunching against the stalks of grass under his feet, desiccated from the heat of the blast. And you're right, I'm not a good person, or even a particularly nice person. I try to do good because I don't want to end up like Sasori, or Pain, or you. I do it, because all of you have been kind enough to show me a glimpse of my future, and show me what a monster I could be. And you know what? The world doesn't need any more monsters. But unfortunately, we keep cropping up, because nature is balance. He was forced to stop by a sudden rush of wind attempting to bowl him over. He recognized the signs of something huge being summoned to the battlefield. Sure enough, when he craned his head he saw an enormous purple snake lift its head above the tree line, framed in ominous silhouette against the rising sun to the east. It stared down at him with slitted golden eyes, a perfect match for its summoner's natural color. He simply stared back, daring it to strike as he drew a slim scroll from one of his flak jacket's pockets. And sometimes it creates a monster, to kill another. For a creature of his size, Manda could strike just as fast as any snake. Inari just barely threw Naruto into the air before the boss summon's fangs sank into the ground where he had been standing. The blonde felt he had made the correct decision when he sent Inari into the ground using the subterranean voyage technique instead of himself, when he saw how deeply those teeth bit into the earth. Each was larger than he was tall, and about twice as thick in the middle. At the peak of his flight he allowed the scroll to flutter open, growing 5 times its original size with a burst of chakra. A part of him had to admit that he had been looking forward to an opportunity to use this. It had really been too long. The ground rumbled when Asura touched down, crouching low to account for the fact that her creator couldn't even be thrown high enough to reach where he needed to go. This was her latest incarnation, a further story taller than the last model, with an additional 2 arms. Naruto owed that particular engineering feat to Pain, after looking at how the man's Asura path worked. She was now effectively a titan over everything she saw, more befitting the otherworldly deity she was based upon. Even when Manda reared back up, the snake's head only reached Asura's upper abdomen, slitted eyes flitting this way and that to try and find the puppeteer. Then the snake had bigger problems as Asura moved forward, not lurched, as something of that size should have done, but took a smooth, well-balanced step, and brought a fist down right onto its scaly head. If Manda's speed was surprising, then Asura's was almost unbelievable. In one of Jiraiya's many anecdotes, he had told Naruto that Manda always bartered a price from Orochimaru for his summoning. It didn't look like he had much time to in this instance. Her great wooden fist came down like a comet, missing Manda by scant inches as the snake flicked his head to the side, straight into one of Asura's waiting palms. When she tried to close her hand around his neck, he hissed warningly and coiled his body in huge, undulating waves. His tail, wrapped in scales harder than steel, lashed out and took Asura in the leg, nearly bringing the titanic puppet to her knees. Naruto watched all of this carefully from within her chest, nestled deep in the strongest, sturdiest part of his puppet where he could safely watch all of this unfold through Inari's Byakugan. In the lead up to this fight, he had trained with her almost to the point of exhaustion, just to get her range up to the required radius. Right now, it just about covered the width of this artificial clearing. He took the strike from Manda's tail so that he could get more of the boss summon's bulk within range. Like a meteor shower, 6 different arms lashed out, grabbing onto whatever they could to get a grip on the snake's smooth purple scales. He still managed to writhe free, the glittering scales concealing ropes of powerful muscle. Using it almost like a rapier, his tail lashed out again, striking at Asura's body with the force of an avalanche. If she had been flesh and blood, it would have knocked the wind right out of her. As it was, her reinforced chest gave a groan of protest under the harsh treatment. He was like a mountain-sized whip, lashing out again and again, forcing Asura to stagger as the sheer concussive force of the kind of snake's blows pushed her back. Large rents now littered her body, and one of her arms dangled from its socket, mostly useless, and in that moment of weakness Manda struck. He lashed forward, mouth opened wide to latch onto the puppet's neck and crush it between his jaws' unmatched strength. Except Manda had never fought a puppet before. He fought like he was facing an opponent of flesh and blood, that felt pain. Asura was under no such restrictions, and when the King of Snakes surged forward, she was just as prepared as she had been when first unsealed. 4 arms met his charge, 2 on each half of his jaw. The 5th looped over his neck, holding him in an improvised headlock. The she pulled, wrenching open Manda's mouth even as the summon continued to batter her with desperate attacks from his tail. They were futile though, unable to reach the heart of the puppet where Naruto remained, unscathed. The moment he had the snake's jaw pulled open wide enough, 100 different compartments opened up along one of Asura's arms. From each, little black capsules spilled out, innocuous on their own save for the fact that each was positively stuffed with explosive tags. Each had enough yield to unsettle a decent-sized building, and Naruto just poured about 200 of them right down Manda's throat. The snake immediately bucked, trying to spit the explosives out. Asura simply reversed her grip and slammed his mouth shut again. Watching him writhe, eyes bulging, as hundreds of explosions ravaging his insides, was deeply satisfying. By the time Asura dropped his limp form, black smoke was drifting out from his mouth. He disappeared in a cloud of white smoke a moment later, sent back to his summoning realm to either recover, or be buried. Naruto didn't particularly care. His eyes were on the small figure that leapt from the snake's head as it fell, grimacing at his summon's defeat. Naruto decided to twist that particular knife a little deeper as an enormous Rasengan swirled to life in one of Asura's palms, larger than the puppet's head. Only the fact that such a massive outpouring of chakra took precious seconds to stabilize saved Orochimaru from being immediately ground into red paste. As it was, the Sannin easily recognized the danger the monumental jutsu posed and quickly bit his thumb. The time it took him to flash through hand seals was about the same as it took Naruto to finish his own technique, and they acted in almost perfect sync. Kuchiyos, Rashomon, Soen, Okibo Rasengan. Some kind of large, demonic-looking gate sprung up from the earth, 2 great steel counterweights swinging on either side, just in time for the spiraling sphere of pure energy to crash into it. Unearthly metal let out a tortured shriek before the Rasengan expanded, filling the clearing with white light and blasting every tree nearby back from the shockwave. When it finally faded, Orochimaru's technique was nowhere in sight, just a deep trench in the ground surrounded by a scarred, circular patch of ravaged earth. Asura paused as Naruto narrowed his eyes to get a better view of the situation. He technically didn't have to, considering it was Inari's eyes he was looking through, but he found it helped him focus. Like with Hanabi's prosthetic, when he tried to zoom in, objects seemed to lose their depth and gained a slightly blurry outline, and he had no natural Byakugan to compensate. Still, he didn't need it to be that precise to see Orochimaru's legs awkwardly sticking out of the ground, surrounded by cracked ground. He almost wanted to heave a sigh of relief when he could plainly see the man's chakra slowly fading away, only to narrow his eyes further. It wasn't fading at all, just retreating. Then the Sannin abruptly slithered out of his own mouth, covered in slime and shedding his body like a snake's skin. After that, Naruto definitely had a new addition to his top 10 most disturbing sights. But, as already established, he wasn't one to balk at gross things, and Asura's leg rose in the air to crush the man into the ground again. He didn't know how many times Orochimaru could do that, but he intended to enjoy finding out. Unfortunately, the man was quick on the uptake and quickly realized that simply blocking Asura wasn't going to do much when the puppet could just continue to smash through whatever defense he could throw up. He leaped back from the descending foot, narrowly avoiding the deceptively fast giantess, already flipping through hand seals. Shikotsumyaku, Sawarabi no Mai. He hissed, slamming his hand to the ground as he landed. The effect wasn't instantaneous, but it was no less devastating. The ground rumbled for a moment before sprouting hundreds of enormous spikes of what looked like solid bone, each of them wickedly sharp and tall enough to reach up to Asura's knees. The puppet was immediately toppled by the loss of her footing, where the deadly nature of the bone field was revealed when they easily pierced through even her reinforced skin. In moments Orochimaru had effectively neutralized Naruto's largest puppet. He could still move her arms, but skewered like this, he couldn't even get her to stand again, and he would be a sitting duck for any more large-scale jutsu Orochimaru might conjure up. The blonde climbed out, standing on her chest and glaring at the Sannin as he balanced on one of his bone spikes. "Do you like it?" Orochimaru called out, smiling in satisfaction at toppling what he deemed to be his opponent's strongest puppet. "A gift from one of my most loyal subordinates, now serving me in the only way left that he could. Such a remarkable bloodline, able to directly control." He was rudely cut off by Inari's tails to the side of his head, sending him flying through his own forest of bones to slam into one of the rib-like spikes. "I really don't care," Naruto muttered, having already gotten the gist from the huge field of bone spikes they now resided in. Inari herself perched atop the spike Orochimaru had been standing on, crouching slightly so that her eighth tail could reach up over her shoulder. As it did, it lengthened out, segmenting in places to reveal interlocking metal parts underneath that crackled with energy. The fur around the very tip of the tail peeled back, revealing a circular hole that was now glowing with light. The chakra cannon discharged with a crack of displaced air that slowly faded into a low hum that had the hairs on Naruto's arm stand on end. Another innovation he had pain to thank for. Despite his use of the Rasengan, he never would have imagined using pure chakra as a weapon like this. Draining, but damnable effective considering the bone spike Orochimaru had been embedded in was now gone, as were the five behind it. Seems somebody took more from their fight with pain than a renewed appreciation for their right hand. The Sannin drawled, only looking mildly annoyed at the blindsiding as he sank out from one of the spikes. The fact that he could apparently do that was somewhat worrying considering where Naruto now stood. He decided it would be better if Orochimaru didn't figure that out, if he hadn't already, and directed Inari to press her attack. She shot forward, bouncing off the spikes of bone like a living pinball before converting that momentum into a spinning kick. Not at Orochimaru, but at the spike his body was emerging from. Her foot connected with a crack and snapped the tip of the spike right off, apparently surprising the Sannin that had been in the process of sinking back into it. He was instead forced to dart out into the air, where Inari refused to allow him to make contact with the bones again. She made liberal use of the unusual terrain to continually bounce up at Orochimaru to harry him with brutally powerful attacks. Without leverage, there was little the Sannin could do except block, and each blow only launched him back into the air, away from the relative safety of the bone field. Eventually, he got tired of being battered about in the air like a hacky sack and managed to grab one of Inari's arms. Her clawed fingers curled in, raking across his forearm, but he either didn't feel or didn't care about the poison that laced them. He twisted his body and tried to use the momentum to throw her to the ground, but the fact that he had a grip on her meant the same was true in reverse. When they both fell towards the ground, her tails snapped out, catching a few of the bone spikes on their way down and bringing them to a stop. Now fully trapped and suspended above the ground away from his escape, Naruto forced her to clench her hands as hard as she could, hoping he could snap the Sannin's arms right off. Not a fan of this plan, Orochimaru opened his mouth disgustingly wide, revealing a snake that had seemingly crawled up his throat. More worryingly, the snake's mouth was also open, to showcase a long sword blade stored inside. Inari only just got her head out of the way as the weapon abruptly extended forward, cutting a small gouge into her neck. That was actually surprising, as Naruto hadn't detected wind chakra around the weapon, and normal steel shouldn't have been nearly enough to damage Inari's skin. Surprising enough, apparently, for Orochimaru to twist out of her grasp, using the sudden recoil of his sword contracting to flip himself up so that he could use Inari as a stepping stone. That proved a mistake when a compartment in her abdomen opened up to reveal a specialized storage seal. It released a cluster of senbon like a mine, spraying the air above her with the deadly projectiles. Thinking quick, Orochimaru once again extended his sword, intending to both skewer Inari and use the extension to push himself even higher. The moment before it connected though, the previously invisible chakra strings connecting Inari to her puppeteer suddenly flared like little orange streaks of fire through the air. Inari was sent crashing into the ground from the force of the blade, but she was far from skewered. Orange light wreathed her hands where she gripped the sword, holding the tip a few scant inches from her chest. The moment she hit the ground, the sudden reversal indeed forced Orochimaru higher into the air, only for Inari to twist her body to the side. She had intended to simply snap the blade. There were few materials a QB-enhanced Inari couldn't break with her bare hands, but apparently whatever weapon this was, it didn't break easy, or bend, apparently. The moment Inari turned, the entire length of the sword, like it was a rigid pole, swerved 90 degrees. Thanks to the handy conservation of angular momentum, this meant that Orochimaru was slammed into the ground from about 50 feet in the air very fast. The plume of dust from his collision with the ground nearly reached as high as he had been, and hadn't fully settled by the time Inari darted through the bone forest after him. He had managed to make a small clearing in the sea of white spikes, and from the look of the disturbing empty skin lying nearby, he had been forced to use his regeneration technique again. The man himself stood on the other side of the impromptu clearing within a clearing, standing still and grinning up at the puppet. Standing very still. Too still. Naruto's eyes widened and the chakra string he had been subtly working towards Asura flared orange with the Kyuubi's chakra. One of her great arms lifted into the air, palms splayed as numerous little compartments opened up along its surface. Dozens of little canisters sped out, launched like cannonballs to cover the clearing. These weren't explosives though. The moment they hit the ground they burst open, spreading a thick green gas into the air. Orochimaru chuckled amusedly as the entire clearing was swiftly bathed in a pale green miasma. Come now Naruto-kun, you must know by now that poisons don't work on somebody like me. Oh, I know, the blonde replied through Inari, wearing a wicked grin as he pulled up his goggles and a thin scarf from around his neck. Both were inscribed with seals that would prevent him inhaling any of the gas himself. It really wasn't pleasant stuff. It's not for you. The Sannin's Sharingan flickered back to his environment, noting how everything from the crushed grass beneath his feet, to the trees as far as he could see, was rapidly wilting and dying. In seconds, the entire clearing, and what looked to be a good chunk of the forest beyond, was blackened and dead. A low hum of frustrated approval rumbled from Orochimaru's throat as he felt the natural energy of the area wither away along with the plant life. Very clever, he drawled. Inari matched Naruto's smile as she hopped down into the crater with the Sannin. He was particularly proud of this one, after spending more than a few sleepless nights thinking of a way to combat Senjutsu. After all, if Jiraiya had it, then others might too. After learning something of its full capabilities from the man himself, there was no way he wasn't going to try and prepare for it. In the beginning, all he could imagine was making his puppets stronger and faster to match, but eventually it occurred to him that he didn't have to match it, when he could simply deprive his opponent of it. Draw power from nature. Remove nature as a variable. The only drawback was that he had to notice his opponent before they could access Sage Mode, which became somewhat problematic when he noticed how the purple tattoos around Orochimaru's eyes had thickened considerably. Even with Inari's Byakugan, he almost missed the man move, it was so fast. One moment he was 30 feet away across a shallow crater, the next he was in front of Inari, knifed hand drawn back to strike. Inari got her orange-wreathed hands up in time, but she might as well not have done anything at all. Orochimaru's hand moved like water, flowing around her guard without losing any momentum and taking her right in the shoulder. It stuck in deep, slicing through her reinforced body like a sword, and when Inari retaliated, twisting her body sharply to slam him with her tails, he reacted with almost preternatural speed. His other arm came down to contemptuously slap away 4 of her tails at once, allowing his body to twist out of range of another 4 like his body had no bones. Only one managed to graze him, and Naruto might as well have brushed him with a feather for all it seemed to do, despite the fact that Naruto knew full well a blow like that could have cracked rock. He set his teeth and prepared himself for the slog this would become. He sure was glad that he had cut off Orochimaru's Senjutsu molding when he had, if this was how terrifying he became in Sage Mode. It was as much of a slaughter as the blonde had feared. Inari was his best puppet, stronger, faster, more durable than most high-level Junin when under his sweet ministrations. With a little bit of the Kyuubi's chakra circling her artificial network, she became even more dangerous, her touch actually becoming corrosive and her durability increased threefold. Orochimaru made her look like a genin, practically dancing around her with deeply unnatural flexibility, and somehow managing to strike her even when his blows missed. And they weren't playful slaps either. Fairly quickly Inari was covered in dents and scratches, artificial musculature exposed in places. Orochimaru even took the insult further by ripping two of her tails off. He spun around her once more, slashing his arm down and cleanly severing Inari's left arm at the shoulder, with nothing but the edge of his hand. All the while, his glowing Sharingan stared right at Naruto's position through the forest of bones, taunting him with the ease he dissected the blonde's best. Naruto merely narrowed his eyes, forcing Inari to stand and move low to the ground, tails coming up over her shoulders like 7 furry scorpion stingers. Two fired at once, forcing Orochimaru to sway his body between a hail of senbon moving so fast even his Sharingan saw them as blurs, and a jet of water that made short work of the bone spikes behind him. He did so though, elegantly and easily shifting his body in whatever direction he needed to go in order to avoid the twin streams of death. He didn't even try to move forward, even though it was obvious he could if he wanted to. When the joint attack cut off, Inari hunched forward. The collar around her neck pulsed for a moment with seals before releasing what looked like blue steam with a hiss. Orochimaru's eyes dissected it in moments. Finally figured out a way of using more than one tail at a time, Naruto-kun. Purging the entire network is a rather ingenious way to mitigate the overload, I admit. Completely impossible in a human after all, it would kill them. But, he darted forward, nearly vanishing from Naruto's eyes. It must take a moment to reassert control, leaving your puppet vulnerable. He flickered back into review with his hand already speared through where Inari's heart would be. Was she human? Not a lethal blow to a puppet, but Orochimaru wasn't done. He spun around the retaliatory swipe and grabbed one of her tails before lifting her up and slamming her into the ground, hard enough to cave her chest in. Using the tail as a continued point of leverage, he placed his foot on the back of her neck and pulled. The puppet died with a sickening crunch of shattered wood, immediately falling limp. Naruto's eyes widened at the casual execution, hands immediately searching for another scroll in his jacket. Orochimaru didn't exactly give him much of a chance though, as he leapt from within one of the bone spikes not a second later, landing on Asura's chest with him. The sword was already extending from his mouth, skewering the scroll before he could even unravel it. It would have impaled him too if he hadn't narrowly thrown himself out of the way. You're sorely mistaken if you think I would allow you to unseal another puppet, Naruto-kun, Orochimaru drawled languidly, moving forward as if he had all the time in the world. Who needs to unseal anything? Naruto shot back, breathing a little heavier from the near miss that, if he knew the Sannin, was probably intentional. When you're standing on one. Asura's hand came down like a human swatting a fly from their body, its shadow hidden in the glare of the sunrise. It should have come down with enough force to crush just about anything. Even without Naruto directing it to swing down, there was a good 3 tons of solid hand there. And Orochimaru caught it. The pale-skinned man's knees only buckled slightly as he kept the hand from crushing him flat, grinning at the blonde from under its weight. Ah, Senjutsu really is magnificent, isn't it? Almost makes me wish I hadn't brushed of Jiraiya for all those years when he used to pester me and Tsunade over it. I owe Kimimaro for more than just his clan's wondrous Kekkei Genkai, but for a body that can withstand this awesome power as well. He slithered forward when Asura curled her fingers, intending to trap him in the prison of her hand. It closed on nothing but air, and Naruto rapidly backpedaled, his own fingers working frantically. Compartments along Asura's chest opened up, spewing kunai, senbon, explosive canisters, and just about anything else that might cause the Sannin damage. Orochimaru dodged them all with an impossibly liquid grace, completely untouchable as he closed the distance between them, spinning red eyes locked on Naruto's panicking blue. Some kami must have been watching their battle, because in those few scant moments when Orochimaru lurched forward, mouth already open to reveal the gleaming edge of the Kusanagi no Tsurugi, the tattoos around his eyes finally shrank back, what natural energy he had managed to gather used up. It was the only thing that allowed Naruto to act quickly enough, throwing his artificial arm out in front of him. The blade scythed clean through the prosthetic, burying itself up to the hilt along the full length of his outstretched arm and just narrowly avoiding hitting flesh as it emerged from his tricep. His artificial fingers twitched weakly, most of the tendons controlling them severed. Still marveling at his luck, Naruto acting quickly. A whirring noise emanated from his arm as the unnatural chakra system within suddenly constricted. When Orochimaru tried to pull his blade back and finish the job, he found it securely fastened in place. The whirring also disguised the sound of the Rasengan spinning to life in Naruto's other hand, though he didn't bother trying to hide it when he abruptly slammed it into Orochimaru's stomach. It ground mercilessly into the man's abdomen until the Sannin relinquished his hold on the sword and was promptly blasted back. Naruto used the opportunity to roll awkwardly back to his feet, pulling the blade out of his arm with a grimace. The artificial limb didn't feel pain, per se, but he still sort of felt the steel sliding out of the prosthetic, and it was unpleasant to say the least. He tried moving the arm, but found it worse than useless after the abuse it had been put through. With a sigh, he allowed it to detach from his shoulder and fumbled awkwardly for a scroll in his flak jacket, still holding the sword. Always have spares, he mumbled as he unsealed the replacement limb and used chakra strings to pull it into position. Ironically, you helped me learn that lesson, in the Chunin exams. Orochimaru was a little busy vomiting himself a new body, so Naruto took the opportunity to examine the sword in his hand. It was incredibly light and extremely well balanced, with a faint pearlescent sheen that seemed to shift like the blade was coated in poison, but there was no actual liquid on the sword. He gave it a few test swings, but Kenjutsu was never his thing. Instead, he chose a random direction and threw it as hard as he could, quickly losing it in the forest of bones surrounding them. Hopefully, if it was lost to him, it was lost to Orochimaru too. From the glare in those cold Sharingan eyes, Orochimaru didn't seem to appreciate that. Considering the fact that the man would have cleaved his arm in half if pain hadn't already done the lion's share of the job for him, Naruto wasn't inclined to care. With a sloppy salute he turned on a heel and darted out into the maze of white spires, surprising Orochimaru for a second before his eyes flashed and the man gave chase. He must have burned, decapitated or shredded 5 different dummy decoys before locating Naruto back in the crater where Inari's broken form still lay. Running back to broken puppets Naruto-kun. I didn't perhaps nick you with the Kusanagi before you so callously threw it away, did I? Who said anything about broken? The blonde shot back with a smirk, lifting a hand. A single chakra string became visible, attached to Inari's 9th tail, the one Orochimaru had yet to see the function of. Strangely though, it wasn't the usual bright blue, or even fiery orange, but pale, almost white. The small crater seemed to rustle unnaturally as blank white sheets pulled themselves away from the environment, fluttering through the air like odd, flat birds. They congregated around Inari, attaching to where she was most damaged and seamlessly melting into her body until the puppet looked good as new, back on her arched feet and matching her controller's smirk. It was a perfect mirror to Orochimaru's narrow-eyed frown. Conan's Shikigami abilities. I spent 8 months figuring out how that worked, you know. Even with the specially attuned chakra. I'll tell you, it was nothing compared to this. The environment hadn't stopped shifting, even after Inari was fixed. Random, otherwise camouflaged rectangles of paper flipped over everywhere the Sannin looked, revealing the all-too-familiar Fuinjutsu design inscribed on each. I can't manage nearly as many as she could yet, but I like to think I make up for it with individual yield. A suicide gambit. Orochimaru mused skeptically, body tensed. I didn't think you had it in you. The blonde just scoffed. Whoever said this was the real me? Naruto waited until the rumbling had stopped completely before poking his head up from a compartment within Asura that had previously been used to store kunai. He had never gone into the bone field at all, instead waiting here while coordinating with shadow clones to plant thousands of explosive tags while Orochimaru was led on a merry little chase. They had been doing so ever since Orochimaru had created the bone spikes, having been waiting at the edge of the clearing just out of sight for precisely such a gambit. And they only got one shot, because that move used up most of Conan's chakra that he had stored in Inari's tail. He could make more, but it took a lot of time, that he didn't really have. Still surveying the battlefield, which had been reduced to little more than a field of white rubble and a few jagged spikes jutting from the ground, through Inari's Byakugan, he could see Orochimaru was in bad condition. Entire sections of his skin had been burned off, revealing what looked to be solid plates of bone just beneath the surface. Even despite that extra layer of armor, he could already see the Sannin's chakra retreating inward for that regeneration technique, which he had no intention of letting the man complete. Some of the paper that had previously been shoring up Inari detached to fly through the air and surround Orochimaru. He tried swatting it away, but it was paper, it just flowed around him until it could latch onto whatever it could, until the entire man looked like some absurd art project, completely encased in paper. A black ceiling design began to snake across the newly pristine canvas, a slightly more refined version of the one he used to restrain Hisashi, until Naruto's brow furrowed in consternation. The paper prison fell away to reveal nothing but melting mud. You're not the only one adept at clone decoys, Naruto-kun, Orochimaru hissed as he grabbed the puppeteer by the back of the neck and dragged him out of the hidden compartment. The blonde's eyes were wide in surprise at being snuck up on. The only way Orochimaru could have escaped his Byakugan's sight was deep enough in the ground, or by using the insulating nature of Asura against him. Damn, if Orochimaru had managed to use the subterranean voyage technique on something with a chakra network, even inactive and inanimate like Asura, then that was just scary levels of control. Ah, he choked out as snakes emerged from Orochimaru's sleeves to bite into his neck, dispelling the henge around Dami. But adept isn't mastery, is it? Orochimaru didn't even have time to scowl before one of Asura's hands came down on top of him, scraping him off the puppet's chest before slamming him into the ground. This time he didn't have the benefit of Sage Mode to hold it back. Naruto thought he could end it there if he was lucky, and forced Asura to roll over in order to apply more pressure and squash the Sannin for good, ripping large holes out of her torso from where she had been impaled by the bone spikes. Something was pushing back though, hard. Gradually, Asura's hand was forced up, and whatever was doing it was gaining momentum. Then, all at once, the titanic puppet was thrown back as something rapidly expanded to fill the space. Even with the Byakugan, Naruto naturally found his neck craning back to look up at the monster Orochimaru had either summoned, or more worryingly, become. It was enormous, possibly as tall as Asura standing when it reared back its heads, all 8 of them. A huge, 8-headed white snake creature at least twice as large as Manda had been, and all 8 heads were staring right down at him. One of them shuddered, before opening its mouth to reveal Orochimaru halfway fused with its tongue. Become, not summoned, good to know, if not particularly helpful right now. I'm impressed Naruto-kun, I never expected anybody to be able to push me this far. But, I'm afraid this is the end. My Yamata no Jutsu is the pinnacle of my power, where I transcend from snake to dragon. The blonde just stared up at the man, tilting his head slightly with a hand cupped around his ear. What? 9 sets of eyes instantly narrowed to enraged slits as Orochimaru disappeared back into whatever abomination he had become. That was good. If he was angry, he was less likely to notice when Asura abruptly rolled over, throwing her 5 working arms out and desperately grappling anything within her reach. The creature hissed and writhed, its long, powerful body bucking, but Asura was implacable and felt no pain. Even when it lashed out with viciously fanged mouths and ripped great rents out of the titanic puppet, she didn't let go. It was a stalling tactic at best. With Asura crippled as she was, he had nothing else in his arsenal to deal with anything so large. Well, that wasn't quite true, he just hated using it. With a sigh, and understanding he had little other choice, he directed Inari to race toward the beast Orochimaru had become, running on all 4s with her tails poised over her back, like a furry chalice. He idly created a clone and had it take over the reins of Asura. It wouldn't last long due to the QB's chakra needed to operate her, but it should be long enough. He needed his full attention on this. Just like he had against Kakazu, he began going through the process of creating an enormous Rasengan over Inari's back. Only, instead of his chakra, he tapped deep and flooded the technique with the Bijuu's far more potent energy. The first time he had experimented with this, he had obliterated 2 training grounds by accident, and got a long reaming from the Sandaime for carelessness. More cautious testing had revealed that, in large enough quantities, the QB's chakra tainted and twisted whatever jutsu it was used to fuel. The Rasengan, for some reason, was a little different. As it grew on Inari's back, and Naruto continued to flood it with chakra, it slowly darkened and lost the swirling, pulsing quality that distinguished the jutsu. When it reached some indefinable threshold, better resembling an almost solid black sphere resting over his puppet's back, it abruptly collapsed in on itself, shrinking to 1/5 its size under its own weight. Inari similarly buckled, crushed against the ground even with all of her limbs tensed and tails visibly shivering under the effort of containing it. That was the main problem with this technique. Despite its power, Naruto had figured out no conceivable way to throw, direct or even bloody move the damn thing once it was formed. For all intents and purposes, it was just an absurdly powerful bomb that would obliterate his puppet, and just about anything else nearby. Which was why he hated using it. It was practically useless against an aware, mobile opponent and killed his best puppet. Inari wasn't exactly cheap or easy to replace. But, against something big, unwieldy and currently held back by Asura, it was undoubtedly the single most destructive technique he could bring to bear, and after his last disastrous attempt to use it, Jiraiya had even been kind enough to tell him its name. Soen, Bayudama, he muttered, before he relaxed his control over Inari, and the world went white. The funny thing about almost being killed by an exploding, hyper-dense sphere of pure energy, the first time at least, is that it very quickly encourages you to think on ways for it to not kill you in the future. Some might have argued that sinking 10 feet underground and unsealing a large hollow sphere of alternating resin-treated wood and tempered steel to hide inside might have been overkill. Considering the fact that he certainly wasn't 10 feet below ground by the time the world stopped shaking, and that the first 5 layers of his defense were just gone, Naruto would argue that a certain amount of caution was appropriate. When he finally pulled himself out of the ground, exhausted from that enormous energy expenditure, his feet crunched against what used to be the soil. Now it was blackened glass, hissing and popping and still glowing at the center of the crater that used to be a clearing, and was now a much bigger clearing. The air was scorching hot, and in seconds he felt like he needed a long, cold shower. There wasn't much left of anything up here, even Asura had been reduced to half of a vaguely smoking husk, crumbling even as he watched. He really hoped his clones had the initiative to move Anko and Sasuke further away. And still, even after all of this destruction, he had a sinking feeling that Orochimaru wasn't quite done yet. Not when he couldn't see the body. Unfortunately, that was confirmed in the worst possible way when the Kusanagi burst through his back, pinning him to the ground and pulling a sharp gasp from him. Very impressive Naruto-kun, Orochimaru drawled languidly as he strolled around to the blonde's front, looking as undamaged and unhurried as when they had begun all of this. Such destruction at your fingertips, why, it will almost be a shame to never witness you at the peak of your abilities. His eyes gleamed, rotating almost tauntingly. But it is over. These eyes have finally picked apart you from your little decoys, and I'm certain this time that you are no puppet. Naruto coughed, splattering blood on the ground in front of him. Every time he moved he felt icy jolts of pain lance through his body. Still, he managed a bloody grin as he looked up into those victorious red eyes. Yeah, you're right, I'm not. Then his eyes shifted slightly to look behind the Sannin, but he is. And then the shadow clone burst into smoke, right as Dami stepped into range. And you're within my field of divination, asshole. Orochimaru spun just in time to get slammed in the chest by the first 2 strikes. 2 points, Dami cried, following up with a brutal series of jabs at Orochimaru's vitals. 4 points. He hadn't even bothered to henge the puppet, simply allowing the almost human mannequin to lay into Orochimaru, completely exposed. 8 points. The tempo only increased, leaving no room for retaliation as Dami ruthlessly exploited every exposed bit of flesh to strike out at. 16 points. Wooden hands became nothing but a blur of motion, almost overtaking the out-loud count. 32 points. By the time he took the integral step forward that completed the technique, Orochimaru's body was a juddering mess in front of him, stripped bare by the puppet's Byakugan. Soen, Rokujuyan Tensu. The final strike blasted Orochimaru's limp body back, sending him tumbling head over heels across the cooling glass, where he lay sprawled out. It took the man a moment, just laying down on the ground, stunned, before he slowly picked himself up, brow furrowed. Then, a smile slid across his features as his eyes flicked back up to Dami. An interesting variation on the Hyuga's famous technique Naruto-kun, but I must confess, far less effective without the closing of my tenketsu. Naruto chose that moment to appear, sinking out of the ground behind Dami, keeping the puppet between them, still wary for any ploys, to speak to the Sannin directly. His body language screamed exhaustion and fatigue, but he still managed a cold smirk. I was never aiming for your tenketsu. He sighed as Orochimaru's frown returned. The Byakugan is such a useful tool, and sometimes I think it's wasted on such a restricting, limited set of techniques. With those eyes I can almost pick you apart on a cellular level, Directly targeting your endocrine system was as simple as slightly shifting the stance. Dami lifted a hand, the ends of his fingertips glinting slightly in the early morning sun. A closer look would have revealed tiny metal needles emerging from his fingers, now empty. The pale-skinned man looked down and, instead of the usual red welts that resulted from the Hyuga's signature technique, he saw spreading patches of gray, necrotic flesh. I wanted you to know, Naruto continued, as Orochimaru's body rapidly decayed from the inside out, that you actually have yourself to thank for this particular poison. I reversed engineered it from the enzymes you so helpfully provided when you killed the Sandaime. Naruto had been calmly walking forward as he spoke, observing the dying Sannin with nothing less than supreme satisfaction. So, I suppose this one's really from the Hokage. Eyes wide, Orochimaru's mouth opened sickeningly wide and ejected another fully formed copy. It did nothing, the patches of dead tissue still continued to grow, feeding off of Orochimaru's very life energy to replicate and consume. Now panicking, the man's mouth opened again, only this time it ejected something entirely inhuman. Some hulking, pale creature that looked like it was formed from smaller white snakes that bore some mocking facsimile of Orochimaru's face. Naruto could only grimace at the lengths Orochimaru had gone through for his immortality, as the vile abomination continued to writhe on the ground. Even in this form, the virulent poison continued to ravage Orochimaru's body, killing him at a cellular level. He screamed and writhed, both in pain, frustration, and fear, as the shivering mass of his body shriveled and decayed. Finally, there was nothing left but a single little white reptile, no larger than an average grass snake. It broke away from the mass before it could be infected and desperately slithered away from Naruto as fast as it could, awkwardly wriggling over the cracked glass and broken earth. It let out a pitiful hiss of agony as the Kusanagi speared through its body, pinning it to the ground. From there, it could only look up and cower under the vindictive glare of its former student. Anko's chest rose and fell heavily, hand quaking even with the small effort of stabbing the sword into the ground. 17 years I've been waiting for this, you bastard. Her eyes grew cold as a smile spread across her lips. But there's no wriggling out of this one, is there? She gave the sword a sharp twist that earned her another pained hiss. Stay dead this time. And without any more ceremony, no last-minute escape or miraculous getaway, she planted a kunai right in the snake's head, driving it right down to the handle. A moment later, the last remains of Orochimaru burst into black flames, causing her to look up in surprise at the Uchiha standing behind her. Just to be sure, he muttered, before walking past her to Naruto. The blonde himself was simply laying back on the warm glass, having left Orochimaru's end to his student. He'd done the hard work, but she probably deserved the closure, or something. He was too tired to particularly care at this point, as long as Orochimaru was actually dead. So, it's over? Sasuke asked, looking down at the exhausted puppeteer with a quirked brow. He and Anko had blacked out right at the start of the fight, and by the time they woke up, courtesy of the apocalyptically large blast of Naruto's Bayudama, things seemed to mostly have wrapped up. All they had to show for it was a dull ache in their neck and a deep weariness that didn't quite match up to Naruto's mental and physical exhaustion. I sure as hell hope so, he muttered, letting his head fall back, because I'm shit out of tricks to throw. That's it, bottom of the bag, nothing left. My pockets are officially empty. Seriously. He paused, shrugging weakly. Okay, so I had a couple more tricks. Sasuke just took another look around the clearing, the blackened glass now sparkling in the sunlight streaming over the treetops to the east. We're definitely having a spar at some point. That at least managed to pull a chuckle from the spent blonde. He raised a hand and gave his former teammate a lazy thumbs up that even Shikamaru would have been proud of. Sure thing, it fell to his side, limp, just as soon as I can move again. It looks good, Naruto said as he and Hanabi walked into the mission office. He grinned as Jiraiya jerked in place, having been hunched over the little crystal ball that the Sandaime used to play about with. Ah wah, he greeted eloquently, blinking as he looked up at the pair, half scowling, half abashed at being interrupted. Eventually, he followed Naruto's eyes out of the large panoramic window behind his desk that overlooked the village. More specifically, to the latest addition to the Hokage monument, proudly grinning out at Konoha in the mid-morning light. Are you kidding? They got my nose all wrong, he muttered petulantly, thumbing it for emphasis. Ain't no way some rock is gonna catch my manly handsomeness. Although, even saying that, there was no disguising the slight smile he wore when he saw his own face up there, alongside his sensei and his student. Whatever, the blonde drawled, motioning airily with his hand to pull Jiraiya out of his nostalgia. So, a mission I'm guessing. Jiraiya continued on smoothly, after coughing into his hand. What'll it be today? B rank, if you would. Jiraiya simply clicked his fingers at the nearby Chunin, getting him to rifle through the dossiers until he found something appropriate. Going hard, huh? That's gotta be the third this week. Yeah, well, I sort of promised, the blonde admitted slowly, glancing down at Hanabi. She was doing her best to avoid his gaze, staring forward stoically and only moving to step forward and take the offered mission. Chunin exams coming up and all, figured it would be best to make sure she can handle anything. Hanabi just huffed, grabbed the folder, gave a respectful nod to the Hokage, turned on a heel and smartly strode out of the room. She didn't give her sensei so much as a second glance. Still giving you the cold shoulder, eh? Jiraiya offered with a crocodile's sympathy. He was loving it really. She'll come around, Naruto replied without much conviction. Nearly 3 months since he had defeated Orochimaru, and Hanabi was still brushing him off for not telling her what he was doing. As if he would ever take her somewhere that dangerous, not that she particularly cared for the logic of the situation. Eventually, he waved his hand dismissively. Speaking of women coming around, you managed to track down Tsunade yet? Jiraiya's grimace was all he needed as an answer, but the man motioned to the little crystal ball on the desk anyway. It might go a lot better if you just tell me how this thing worked. Sarutobi-sensei must have told you something. The blonde merely smirked. It depends, are you going to use it properly, or to peek into the hot springs? Jiraiya couldn't have hidden his perverted blush even if he wanted to, prompting the Chunin to roll his eyes. Don't answer that, the Chunin shouldn't have to hear their Hokage lie like a 5-year-old. So mean, Naruto. Being Hokage is a lot of work you know, which I still blame you for by the way. He scowled at the blonde without much menace. Still don't know how you managed that, but I know it was you. He sighed, thumbing his nose. You just had to drop this in my lap during one of the biggest ongoing political crises in recent memory, huh? All this fake daimyo business would be turning my hair prematurely white if it wasn't already. His shoulders slumped and his lower lip quivered. And you won't grant an old man his creature comforts in his twilight years. Naruto's lips twisted together. Don't do that. It's something the Sandaime would say, and on you it just looks wrong. Jiraiya gave the evil eye to a couple Chunin that broke out in sniggers at that. Whatever, brat. Just get out and go scrape up to your student until she forgives you. One of these days I'll make you the Hokage, and see how you like it. Naruto snorted as he gave the man a mocking salute and sauntered out. Good luck with that, the daimyo actually likes me. He closed the door behind him before Jiraiya could get his last comment in, grinning at the small victory. It wasn't like Jiraiya hadn't had him on the shit list for the past few months ever since he found out what he, Anko and Sasuke had done. Although, he was far less concerned with the older man's opinion of him, than he was with the young girls that was waiting for him in the annex just outside. He sighed at Hanabi's purposeful avoidance of his eye, simply walking off as soon as he joined her, passing him the folder that she had no doubt already read. He'd have to think of something to break the ice soon. Still, Jiraiya's words drifted through his head and briefly made him wonder how he would be as a Hokage. It didn't last long, and his previous thoughts on the matter still stood. He wouldn't be a good leader, didn't have the compassion for it. He would make a good advisor though, or spymaster. Hell, he had effectively taken up Jiraiya's old job ever since the man settled into the chair. For a moment, he glanced down and regarded his apprentice curiously. His gaze apparently lingered long enough to garner her attention, and she looked back up at him, meeting his gaze for the first time in what felt like days. What? She was a little surprised by the bright smile he gave her, patting her shoulder fondly. Nothing, just imagining how you'd look wearing a certain hat. He made sure to ruffle her hair, ignoring her glare with an irreverent smirk. Don't worry too much about it, yet. He walked off, and it took a moment for Hanabi to get over her surprise and remember that she was supposed to be angry with him. Oi, what's that supposed to mean? That will be it for this video. If you want more, comment down below, like, subscribe. And see you guys later.